What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy, HUDAK, and I just wanted to take a second as I'm approaching 4,000 downloads on the show, really within 2 months of inception, to just say thank you to everyone that has listened, because this has been really validating in ways that I can't explain, just for the fact that this was such a blank canvas for me. And it is a risk in a way. I think it's a lot easier to start a show covering a specific team, focusing on a specific angle. And I guess that might subconsciously be happening with really all the psychological principles that I brought into this. But, the reality is I could have probably made this very Tulane centric and gotten some traction with that. Easy to start with the Saints, given that this was coming right on the heels of OTAs and minicamp. But I've always really wanted to go back to what I fell in love with in the first place with this game. And that's really kind of the philosophy, the mental aspect, and all of that really to me starts with head coaching. And as I've kind of explored this series, there's a reason, obviously, that I'm kind of on this Bill Parcells tree, which is something that I'm really going to kind of expand upon in today's episode. But I started it off a little unconventionally with Dan Campbell as the example. It would have been easy to go Sean Payton, and there's plenty of anecdotes really there. And I'm not sure I'm done exploring him yet. Just focusing on Ambush in, my most recent solo episode that I did on the heels of the Dan Campbell episode, because I'm really kind of trying to focus this on really small traits that I think start to paint a larger picture and looking at what I think makes a true good NFL head coach. And it's really, to be honest with you, a huge contrast from kind of these young offensive savvy coaches who allegedly could quote unquote relate to today's players better. I think that's really just ageist bias to a degree, and just looking at some bad examples of coaches that I think were just a little bit in the older boys club at a certain point. But I don't think that we're necessarily on the correct thing there when it comes to motivation and guys that can relate to players, because to me, deciding to relate to someone is a choice. And if it's an athlete to athlete, that's really an easy common thread. Then you think of someone like Bill Belichick, who, he played at Wesleyan, but is definitely not known for being a good football player. He's known for being a student of the game. But we might not really have seen his career trajectory unfold the way that it did without the influence of Bill Parcells and him giving him a chance, even in the face of players that had grown to trust Parcells, really not sure if they could get behind the hiring of him as a defensive coordinator. And again, a lot of that being perception bias of thinking that this guy had no playing experience. He doesn't look like one of us kind of thing. But it comes down to belief. And that's something that started with Dan Campbell, because how do you get players to buy in when you're 0-8? And all of that to me really comes down from this coaching tree of Bill Parcells that I could do its own kind of series on, but really kind of trying to scratch the surface of the top of that coaching tree today. Again, when you're trying to explore a coaching tree, I just don't have time with the format of the show to really dive into, again, the entirety of someone like Bill Parcells. So that's kind of why I started small, because again, when I've explored coaching, when I've explored covering the game of football, it's all really been through the lens of growing up being a Saints fan. So obviously my inclination is really to look at the style of Sean Payton, but I've gotten to the point where I can definitely take a step back and see the value in head coaches among the league that aren't just the ones that I have this kind of childhood connection to. But again, for as much as Sean Payton is touted as this offensive guru and genius in the way that he schemed and saw as Drew Brees when really no one else saw him coming, and did discover a lot of quarterbacks, including wanting to draft Tom Brady back, I believe, on the Cowboys staff. Maybe that was when he was on the Giants staff, but it all comes down to, again, I think his guts and his ability to connect with players. And I was writing an article midway through Sean Payton's final season with the Saints and looking at this idea of not having it in your DNA to really throw in the towel. I don't remember what the exact situation was on the Saints, but my actual inspiration from that came from an article that I had read that I've now discussed a few times on the show. And sorry, that was my timer going off for my intro, which I already finished. But I was reading this article about how Dan Campbell is sustaining culture in the face of an 0-8 record. And that made me stop and want to read that, because I remember when Dan Campbell got hired by the Lions, and I was at home for Christmas. And again, my love for football came from the Saints, but also really kind of these philosophical discussions I'd have with my dad. And we couldn't really figure out what exactly it was about Dan Campbell, because again, it's not someone that you think of in the Sean McVay light of, that kind of whiz kid guy. So we were thinking there's probably something that we're missing here, because when you look at the coaching tree, again, he comes from Sean Payton. He comes from Bill Parcells himself, separate to Sean Payton. Maybe there's something here that we aren't seeing on the surface. And so I've always just kind of been a curious observer. And then as I'm kind of going through thinking about this coaching series, I started it out with this idea of wanting to explore philosophy, because I had been reading books in the little bit of downtime that I have that could explore things that I wasn't trying to do in the scouting academy. I've read countless defensive strategy books on defensive line, defensive play calling, how to scout defensive backs, all extremely valuable information. But I had all these head coaching books kind of put aside that I really wanted to dive into, but it's never had the time. And so I'm sitting there kind of reading through this and trying to come up with what did I want to talk about in the episode that, had originated with Dan Campbell, because honestly, I kind of hit a blank on what I could really talk about. That didn't feel like I was just kind of beating a dead horse on, current topics. And so I kind of outlined exploring the idea of a coaching philosophy and, looking at what is a philosophy, first of all. How does one develop that, which was inspired by something I had read on Pete Carroll at USC and how he learned to kind of define his philosophy. I'm still trying to kind of figure out what if there's a technical definition for that. But my third point of that, after you define a philosophy, was how do you get players to buy into said philosophy? So that was my loose format heading into that episode. And I didn't really have an exact idea in mind. And this is why it's very helpful to have the relationships with mentors. In line with this episode, I called my boss, who has been just incredibly valuable as a mentor throughout developing the show, and Dave Grubb, and we were just talking back and forth. And Dan Campbell just naturally came up in the conversation. He's a Lions fan, but I was telling him kind of these traits that I want to look at, and the idea of being a motivator. And that's also inspired by my time at Tulane and watching a team literally buy in to a conference championship after winning 2 games. That's something that's always stuck with me. You can talk so much about all the play on the field of Tulane last season, but to me, it all started with a psychological buy-in back in March. And so then trying to think of, okay, how do I tangibly go about this? Am I going to do some historical look back on Pete Carroll at USC and maybe try to tie in Tulane in some cutesy way? The simple answer to me was start with Dan Campbell. And as I was talking about it on that show, and then bringing on Jeremy Reisman, the Pride of Detroit head of the site, and the conversation I most recently had with him, what stuck out to me the most in that conversation was his relationship with Jared Goff and the motivating aspect behind that, and the trust and repairing of a fractured relationship that wasn't really the fault of Campbell and Goff. It was Jared Goff's time in Los Angeles with Sean McVay, but ultimately Dan Campbell is responsible for dealing with the psychological aftermath of that. And as I'm going into this episode, I finished the Sean Payton one, and I'm thinking, what do I do for this episode? And I knew I wanted to go Bill Parcells, but I wasn't exactly sure of the angle to take. And when I had done the Saints episode, I watched this one on the Saints 2009 season. My idea with Sean Payton was kind of to focus on ambush. And the reason for that was sort of that he developed that idea from having his mentor in Bill Parcells. But the more that I kind of explored that episode on its own, the more that I realized that this has nothing really to do with kind of emulating a mentor. This was really him formulating his own identity. And that's the sign of a true mentor, and listening to the people around you and admitting that you might not be making the right call here by wanting to run a fake punt. Because if there's anyone that has owned up to a really great mistake that has resulted in extreme success thereafter, go back to Bill Parcells and his relationship with Phil Simms. Go! One of my memories of Sean Payton that for some reason sticks out to me is kind of when he publicly admitted that he made a mistake in allowing Malcolm Jenkins to walk out the door, and that he was really being able to make up for that for bringing him back in the final seasons of his career these last couple of years that are after letting him walk following the Super Bowl. And I just remember it sticking out to me because you rarely hear coaches, for really no good reason at all in that moment, say something of that magnitude, that they're owning up to an error and they're doing their best to correct that. And as I said before, this has kind of been this exploration process for me where admittedly I've been trying to study Bill Parcells on the side as much as I can, but it is a long and wealthy set of knowledge and history to get through. And so again, I really enjoyed watching the Super Bowl film on the Saints 2009 season and just really hearing from all the coaches and players of how that season unfolded. And it gave me just a different magic than books give me in really my ability to creatively explore. I would say I kind of get that inspiration then from watching those magic moments play out on film. And so I start thinking about this episode and Bill Parcells, and I'm not going to get through an entire book in a day. And I can read as many articles until I'm blue in the face, but I really want to hear it from players that played for him. And so I sought out one of those America's Game films from NFL Films, and it was on the 1986 New York Giants, and perfect. So I popped this on, and again, I'll admit, I really did not know the history of his first coaching stint with the Giants. I'm more familiar kind of with the ending in Miami and Dallas, but Phil Simms comes on and starts talking about how this relationship with Bill Parcells was really off to a bad start before it started to go anywhere. And really that relationship to me and the unexpected parallels that I saw in the trust and belief in Dan Campbell and Jared Goff really started to paint an interesting picture for me. Just as a quick recap, following the 1983 season, in which I believe they went 3-12, and Bill Parcells was on the hot seat, and he went with the decision to go with Scott Brunner. I'm going to butcher that because I heard the name once or twice, and benched Phil Simms. Phil Simms asks for a trade. He asks him to name 3 teams, and didn't really seem like he tried to trade him that much at all. And to me, there is no greater example of psychology in football than the relationship between a quarterback and a head coach. It's one that is the most paramount and the most delicate. Now, not to get on this whole rant about egos, because I don't necessarily think that they're a bad thing. I think if nothing else, through the examples I've shown, it's through a little bit of arrogance and cockiness, do you get to see greatness in this sport? And so I'm not here to dismiss egos, but when you're talking about head coach and a quarterback, those are probably 2 of the biggest egos on a team. And when you bruise someone's ego and bruise someone's pride and they're a competitor at heart, it's really hard to walk back from that line kind of once you've gone there. But that's where, again, I look at what makes a really good head coach. And to me, it just comes down to the relationship of people and managing that. And knowing that when you make those calls, there are going to be really big consequences. Even in my quarterbacking series that I've explored now in podcast and written form, handling a quarterback competition, handling whether or not you decide to let a quarterback retire on their own terms or push them out with someone else, all of that is as much of a psychological balance as anything else. Even, in the 2017 draft, when the Saints were sitting on being able to draft Patrick Mahomes, Drew Brees comes home early from a trip, and Sean Payton just kind of told him as a one-off that, hey, if Patrick Mahomes is here, we're taking him. And the fact that that was just an okay, sounds good, shows to me how much that relationship was cultivated between the 2 of them, and that trust was there. Because then you look at a situation like Green Bay, where now they're looking at Jordan Love, and maybe that is going to be their 3rd quarterback in a row of greatness. But what if it's not? it's not necessarily a bad call, but it would be hard for me to ignore the psychological rollover of, as much as I don't love Aaron Rodgers, how it must feel to have kind of the same thing done to you. To make a really bad comparison, it's like, if you get someone via cheating and then get cheated on, you have that anxiety because you already know how that kind of happened. And being the guy that pushed someone out, I think that you're a little more on edge when that new person comes in. And if nothing else, it was clear that there was a failure of personality and relationship management going on with Green Bay at that time. So getting back to my original point here, he benches Phil Simms and then they do awful. What do you do now? You can give the quarterback the starting job back. And, that's what ended up happening, but not without a quarterback competition. And that almost sounds kind of not egregious, but, to kind of relate it back to the Saints, people thinking, why did Jameis Winston kind of continue to come back? And after he won the competition, the fact that he then kind of lost it to Andy Dalton and still signed a contract with them to come back, again, that all has to do with all of the management behind the scenes that we're just never going to really get to the bottom of. But Bill Parcells is sitting there with Phil Simms, and the first thing he did was make a mistake. He told him, if we survive this year, we're going to do things my way. And he retained his job. He replaced nearly half the roster and named Phil Simms the starting quarterback. But it goes a step further than that for me, because it's a huge risk to take. And it's the same kind of thing when we talk about when rookie quarterbacks are benched mid-season without really getting the chance to work through their kinks. And then to me, the worst thing you can do is only do that for a few games and then throw them back and throw them out. You have to be so careful with not giving someone just, ghosts that they're never going to stop seeing. And so it just goes past the fact of, okay, well, you have the starting job back, because a quarterback has to feel like they have confidence in command of a room because they are the leader. You can have a defensive minded team with guys like Lawrence Taylor, who, again, when he talks about Bill Parcells, what comes out of his mouth? Yes, he was a great defensive coach. He was started out as a linebacker coach with Lawrence Taylor. So obviously he respects him from a football mind perspective, but it all comes back to the things that they say about him just being able to know how to let players play, being able to envision things, get rid of the nonsense, and motivate and understand how to get the most out of every one of his players. A lot of that came through fear-based motivation. A lot of it comes through tactics like leaving mousetraps in lockers, but honesty is something that I think goes a long way in the NFL. And I think a lot of the time where you see these quarterback fracture situations happen is when they're absent of honesty. That being said, honesty isn't just, a wipe the slate plate. Wipe the slate. Okay. Wipe the slate clean thing, as we're going to do with that word vomit of a sentence. And now I've completely lost my train of thought. And we've got it. Speaking of brutal honesty, I'll be totally honest. That was a complete mess of a 30 seconds for me. But honesty is not just something that you can rely on, and you can become kind of abusive in brutal honesty, because it doesn't really become honesty to a certain point. Has to be a level of trust in order to be able to be brutally honest with someone. Otherwise, it's just harsh, alienating criticism, and there's really no point in doing that at all. And reading how Phil Simms talks about Bill Parcells, he points back to his honesty, because as much as it can feel brutal at times, you always know where you stand. And when I think about the friendships and relationships with a working relationship with the boss and with people I want to associate with in my free time, I am very much a direct person, and I need that in people that I surround myself with. But again, it's not honesty at the expense of not cultivating a relationship to be there in the first place. And I think that's really what you see here. But the final step in that is instilling the confidence that you kind of have to admit you took away from your starting quarterback. And the way that he went about it was he basically said, Sims, if you don't throw at least 2 interceptions today, you're not taking enough chances. That was all that really Phil Simms needed to hear. It was a sign to forget the media, forget the perceptions, and forget being afraid of losing the starting job. The job is yours. And the only way that you're going to get to the top is taking risks. And as much as ball control and not throwing interceptions and how, quintessential things like them switching to man defense against the San Francisco 49ers based on Bill Belichick's advice that Bill Parcells took from him, which is another important thing. But to say, in the face of a quarterback that is probably a little much like a deer in headlights, to just go out there and air it out with no regard for turning the ball over, that's a pretty wild thing for a head coach to say, especially one in, again, this mind of stealing a possession and it all coming down to special teams, hidden yardage, all that stuff, to tell your starting quarterback to just go out there and be a gunslinger. That was the most important takeaway for me of really that entire Super Bowl season that they discussed throughout all of that, was what he did with his relationship with Phil Simms, how he broke it, admitted it in the first place, and really what he did to repair that into something that I think, again, went past the lines of a football field. Go! Coaching trees are just a very interesting thing to me because, we look at them and I'm not really sure what exactly we're doing other than just kind of tracing an ancestry.com style family tree if we're not really looking at what is the common thread here. And I think that a lot of the time that gets discussed with philosophies and schemes and West Coast offense disciples and what have you. But I've always been trying to kind of figure out, what is the Bill Parcells coaching tree at its core? Because it's interesting when you think of kind of the 2 big heads that sit below him in Bill Belichick and Sean Payton. And you look at how many of Bill Belichick's coaching tree that he has really failed. And I think a lot of that comes down to a personality. And I think Bill Parcells was just more a naturally gregarious person. But I think everyone always misses the point with Bill Belichick a little bit, in that they're all just convinced that it's all about the best football mind. And I think that that's correct. But you have to be yourself. And to me, Bill Belichick is a disciplinarian. It came from an Army family. He worked in the various branches of, I can't think of them, Army, Navy, Air Force Academy. I believe that's one that he worked at. His dad worked for the Navy, I believe. And as someone that worked at the VA, this is a really bad blank for me. But when I was reading Football Scouting Methods by his dad, Steve Belichick, it stuck out how militant that the book was written in. Okay, well, here you go, setting a schedule and this, that, and the other. And it resonated really well with me as someone that kind of has a legal background. And I've always just kind of looked at things from that perspective. It just really kind of worked for me. But that's who Bill Belichick is as a person. And I think that people try to emulate him without really having the ability to do so, because that's just a kind of personality that not everyone has. And what if I'm someone that's looking at Bill Belichick and I'm leaving him, I am trying to be my own person. But what's the most important takeaway? To me, it really is his preparation, his attention to detail, his knowledge of the game on such a cerebral level, due to the fact that he really never made it as a player. And that was something that was challenged on a credibility standpoint, which Bill Parcells played, I think, a big point in overturning. But it was really, the individualization of every single opponent. That's, to me, what it comes down to, in really that. And that's why I enjoyed whenever the Saints and the Patriots would play each other, and just watching that chess match of, again, these guys that came from Parcells, that know all kind of the same tricks and are very similar but different, for a lack of a better term. But just that chess match was always something that stuck out to me. But then I look at the Sean Payton side of things, and Dennis Allen is interesting to me because he's a completely different personality type. And maybe that's something to consider here too. I always try to think of, is there any biases that myself or we all are potentially kind of looking at? I think extroversion versus introversion is a huge point, and whether or not someone's a gregarious human being, because I'm an introvert. I'm a huge introvert, but I was a theater kid. I am very gregarious and outspoken, and a lot of people don't believe me when I say there's nothing more that I value than my alone time. But Parcells, gregarious person. Sean Payton, huge people person. Dan Campbell speaks for himself in again, him just being a relatable person, and not this I like wizardry kind of superhuman version of head coaches that I think can kind of lead to us forgetting at the end of the day, again, these are human beings. And who's to say if Bill Belichick gets the kind of start in the NFL he did, if not for him seeking out that knowledge from Bill Parcells, but Bill Parcells really trusting him and the lessons that he was giving him, to the point of allowing him to seek out different opportunities. And because of allowing him that, Bill Belichick ended up wanting to come back and gets promoted to defensive coordinator. You have Lawrence Taylor in there going, who is this guy? He's not a football guy. And Bill Parcells just very calmly responding, this guy was the genius of the season, and that most of the defenses they were running in the 1981 and 82 season were all designed by him, despite never playing football in his life. And because of the credibility and respect that Bill Parcells had, that respect immediately transferred over. He also was smart enough to, again, make reference to football. But you also look at Sean Payton and how much he credits Bill Parcells for giving him a chance and allowing him to learn from him. And when you look at Sean Payton, and when I was looking and doing that episode on what makes him great, again, to say that he is an offensive genius is just a gross understatement. But as much as Drew Brees and the offense played such a prolific role in all of that and the winning of the Super Bowl, to me, it all came down to player trust, confidence, and the guts to engage in psychological warfare. Because to me, that means that you have full belief in your players, full belief that Thomas Morstead is going to successfully kick this onside kick, and it's going to be recovered to your team, to the point of discussing and scripting the first 8 plays of the second half, and just really lying in wait and handling adversity, weathering the storm, and stealing a possession when no one saw it coming. Yes, it was something that was inspired by Bill Parcells, but I think really what the bigger inspiration was his deferment to the coaches that he had hired to make that decision. Very much, again, in the discussion of him hiring Bill Belichick and him going with a lot of his play calling, he went with his special teams coaches on what they saw as the better play. That to me says more about it than him wanting to emulate the fake punt. But you also have to have your players buy in order to do that. And that requires you to have full trust in your players, whether or not the play succeeds or fails. You all have to be so confident about it to make that kind of call and really believe that it has the chance to work. You can't, be ridiculous and just believe blind faith. It's definitely going to work. But to me, you don't call ambush if you don't trust your defense to keep their heads calm, lose half a field, and have it gifted to Peyton Manning and be able to make a stop before the momentum just completely spirals following the gutsiest decision in Super Bowl history going haywire. Because again, the downsides of that are bigger than the payoff if you're looking at it from that perspective. And I'm a pessimist. I am of the Bill Belichick worst case scenario kind of coaching tree. But for every worst case scenario, you always have to wonder, what if it works? That also, again, requires every person on the field to be bought into this crazy idea. Much again, like everyone looked at Tulane players as saying that they were crazy for saying they were going to the conference championship. Well, who's laughing now? And to me, the final nail in that coffin comes down to, his decision to throw that challenge flag on that 2-point conversion. At that point, the Saints, following the recovery of the onside kick, they march down and they have the potential to make it, a game where they can, try to do the math here in my head. If it's 24-17, which it ends up being, then the Colts have to get a touchdown and an extra point to tie, have to go for a 2-point conversion to win. If you lose, then they don't even need the extra point, or they could just get into field goal range twice, and that's the end of it. But the psychology, again, of losing that challenge after gaining so much of that momentum, to have then lost it, lose those 2 points, lose a timeout, and now you're sitting there with 5 minutes remaining. You have 1 timeout left. And they ended up only needing to call 1, but it sticks out to me that if you look at the replay of that footage, Sean didn't make that decision on his own. It really was Curtis Johnson at the end yelling him to throw the flag that he eventually threw it. But to me, again, you don't believe Lance Moore telling you that and insisting that he made that catch. You have to believe him in order to throw that flag, because I think, as we're all aware now, the reality of replay is that it is not an exact science whatsoever. And there isn't a level of faith. There's a level of insanity sometimes with Mike Tomlin, again, just fully going on gut feeling. But gut feeling to me gets dismissed. Intuition is a total other category. But you have to believe your player when they're telling you that, just as much as you believe your staff. And he could have gone conservative there after being gutsy the entire game. But again, to me, the smartest football minds are those that recognize the greatness of everyone around them. And as I'm going through this and exploring what that common thread is that I've been able to kind of trace back down to Dan Campbell, it's awarding them the confidence to instill in others, awarding them that trust because of the trust he placed in them, to then place that trust in their players, and how to motivate them in, unconventional ways. You saw a lot of it on Hard Knocks with Dan Campbell. You hear about the bat game, you hear about the mousetraps in the lockers, but then you hear Drew Brees again talking on these clips about don't eat the cheese. The players really buy into that type of stuff. Again, it can become kitschy if there's really no thought behind it. But the psychological warfare of the game of football, to me, is really the defining characteristic of what I'm looking at here with Bill Parcells, and that trickling down. But it's an umbrella term that requires guts. It requires extreme attention to detail, and it requires complete trust and belief in your players and staff that is reciprocated. Go! Just as Rome wasn't built in a day, this coaching tree series is definitely not going to be built in just this episode format time, unless I gave you guys, a 3-piece novel form, which I'm not going to do on a podcast. But it just goes to show to me that the idea of coaching is just so underexplored to me, from the traits of a coach that go outside of scheming and playbooks. Because I think about putting my scouting academy hat on, and what you look at is, what makes them great? What can they do? Focusing on what they can't do, but really the point being, how can we use their strengths and utilize those best to put them on our field and help us win a game? And to me, that is such a common thread that I would say, again, goes to Sean Payton in spades, in the way that they sat down with Drew Brees, and their first conversation was, we're going to go through the film. We're going to look at what you're good at, what you're comfortable with, what you want to do, and we're going to design this offense around you. That, to me, is a core trait of being a head coach. But all of that to be said, when I look at, what a coach can do and what they can't do, there's 5 core traits that are universal to every single position when I'm talking about this from a scouting perspective, and then, 5 position specific traits. 2 of those traits are mental processing and competitive toughness. There are no football terms that you can use to describe those traits in the way that you can with play strength, of, their functional ability to block, their play speed, which combines their mental processing with their athletic ability, their traits, their quickness, their burst explosiveness, all the buzzwords you hear about the combine drills, their ability to combine that with their mental processing in order to actually make plays. All that to be said, two of the three core, or geez Louise, three of the five core traits to me are about a person, and they're not necessarily about their play on the field. And so when I'm looking at coaching, I'm really curious about what makes a person tick, and what does that do when you're looking at a head coach? And why do these guys who, again, for all of their ego and personal success, why can't they all stop calling, texting, and talking about their old mentors? And I think it matters. It very much matters who your mentor ends up being, but that to me is just nothing to do with X's and O's. And the more that I look at this coaching series and kind of just focusing on one thing at a time, the more at least I'm starting to kind of see a picture here. Because again, Bill Parcells was a coach when I was 6 years old at best. And I just don't have the ability to really experience that in real time the way that I did with Sean Payton and with Dan Campbell. What I can do is look at those guys, look at what I'm kind of seeing as similar traits between Payton and Campbell, then trying my best to kind of familiarize myself with those years of Bill Parcells. But if I'm looking at this from a human perspective, what are the common threads here I'm seeing? And that's why this has kind of taken such a psychological turn here, is because to me, the mental aspect is just as important as anything else. And it's one that is hard to really quantify. And so I think it is one that's hard to discuss, especially in an industry where instant gratification, results, and current events are usually of interest. For the things that I'm talking about here, those are usually in book form. And, not surprising to me that that's really where this inspiration came from. But as I mentioned in several of these shows, with my own personal interest in coaching, but just curiosity in that as a whole, exploring it one area at a time is kind of the way that I've settled on doing it. And like I said, I just focused on one season there for Bill Parcells, and just his handling of his relationship with Phil Simms told me enough of a story to be able to really see what the big picture here was, and how much it comes back to the fact that we all at the end of the day are people. And one of the things I was watching, Bill Belichick was in tears, which completely threw me through a loop, because if the game of football can make Bill Belichick cry, it can strike an emotional chord in all of us. And I think that's really what ends up leaving a legacy, more than your adaptation and innovation of some scheme or system. So that's all for this episode. I won't say it's all on Bill Parcells, because as I said, I've really only just scratched the surface here, but it's something that's also fascinating to me to continue to look at as Sean Payton becomes the head coach of a new team with a new quarterback who certainly has a personality and a history. How does he handle that versus building one from scratch with Drew Brees and really having to essentially put blind faith in one another? You're doing that to a degree with Russell Wilson, but that's something to me that will really continue to show what the true legacy of this idea of a coaching tree that starts at the top with Bill Parcells, especially when you look at the relationship handling of that quarterback role. So that's all for today's show. I will be back on Friday, as always, with a guest. And as this month of July wraps up, I will kind of move into training camp, but I kind of keeping this just in the framework of the conversation, because as much as we always talk about what players did wrong, then you think about, situations again where the play call for the interception that Tracy Porter made on Peyton Manning in the Super Bowl, they switched that, and that wasn't the call that Sean Payton wanted them to run. And so I think there's just as much of a discussion to be had in the coaching aspect of it as much as it is what went wrong on the field, and is perhaps what went wrong on the field due to the psychological effect of a series of miscues by a head coach. Just the idea of throwing a challenge flag almost made me pause and start doing an entire episode. And it probably is something that I'm going to end up doing on how do you make that decision? Is there ever really a right call? And how much do we really use intuition, this thing that's this idea of unexplainable gut feeling? Intuition is the idea, and it's the ability for our subconscious to see things before our conscious mind is telling us that. And that's as much of a curious topic to me as anything else. So I will wrap this up now for this Tuesday's episode, and I will see y'all in a few days.